Released after the biggest metal record of all time, Load didn't just shift the Metallica sound, it nearly split the band's fanbase in half. And yet today, decades later, this so-called sellout album might actually be one of the most misunderstood and the most important ones in the band's entire career. So today, let's take a look at the history behind Metallica's 6th studio record, discuss some interesting facts and controversies around it, and then hopefully finally answer the question why so many Metallica fans actually love to hate it. Here you go.
Do you want heavy? Metallica gives you heavy, baby!
By the way guys, as always, please do not hesitate to comment on anything you hear or see in this video, and especially if you disagree with me, because the whole point of our Metal Pilgrim channel is of course to start a conversation. But alright, let's do it. By the early 1990s, Metallica had done the unthinkable. The Black Album didn't just make them one of the biggest metal bands in the world, it made them one of the biggest bands in the world, in the history of music. Period. They had sold over 30 million copies globally, crossed over into the mainstream while still releasing some of the heaviest material in their career, and played 300 shows promoting their 5th record on the Wherever We May Roam and Nowhere Else to Roam tours. The band was running on pure adrenaline and burnout, very similar to that of Iron Maiden after the release of Powerslave and their massive World Slavery Tour.
It's just outrageous.
So after that cycle ended, they did something they hadn't done in over a decade. They just stopped. Yes, for the first time since Kill 'Em All, Metallica just hit the pause button, and it changed everything for them. James Hetfield took the time to take care of himself. Kirk Hammett studied film, jazz, and Asian arts at San Francisco State University. Jason Newsted started his own recording studio and a bunch of related projects. And Lars Ulrich, well, Lars continued taking care of Metallica business, negotiating a better deal with Elektra Records. Which, of course, he was able to do. And so by summer of 1994, when Lars and James had just started working on the new album, for now just between themselves, the guys who entered Lars's basement studio called The Dungeon were completely different from those who got together to write Kill 'Em All more than a decade ago.
Where's your crown, king? Nothing!
In addition to that, by the mid-90s, the metal landscape overall was very different from that of the early 80s. And yes, it is true that it was partly so because of Metallica themselves and their Black Album, but still, let's not forget that it was the time when Rob Halford left Judas Priest and Bruce Dickinson departed from Iron Maiden, something you simply couldn't even imagine 10 years ago. Kurt Cobain rose to fame changing rock industry and left this world, and thrash metal by itself was pretty much considered dead as a genre. And so when they reconvened at the Plant Studios in Sausalito, California in May of 1995, they didn't really bring thrash riffs and aggressive agenda, but instead they brought nearly 30 full song ideas and a completely new sonic attitude. And of course they also worked with Bob Rock again, who helped them push their sound even more so than he did in 1991. Yet unlike for Bruce Dickinson after the World Slavery Tour, which simply exhausted his creativity, that break has actually not affected Metallica's creative spark. Quite the opposite. Some may say that they had too much stuff to work with, most of which they had actually written on the road. And by the way, running a little bit ahead of myself here, the funniest thing is that despite Load being a huge deviation from the band's early sound, in some capacity they have actually come back to their own roots when it comes to the songwriting process on it. As when they first met at the Dungeon, Lars and James went back to the same methodology they had when they were teenagers, going through James's home recorded, or I guess tour recorded, riff tape cassette collection, and just going through dozens and dozens of riffs, turning them into half-written songs. And it was in such a way, after combining their ideas with those of Kirk Hammett, and with none of James Newsted, of which we'll talk in a moment, that Metallica had come up with 30 full tracks, leading them to an idea of making their 6th record a double album. Yet, just like Judas Priest and their initial twin turbo idea, Metallica decided to split that record into two, turning it into what later became Load and Reload, released a year later. And yet still, despite that split, Load ran for 78 minutes and 59 seconds, making it the longest Metallica album to this very day. And the craziest thing is that the new Load re-release with the original uncut version of the Outlaw Torn will actually make it even longer. But nevertheless, despite that beautiful story of Lars and James doing their thing in a very old school way, when Load dropped in June of 1996, it didn't just sound different, it felt different. Gone were the machine gun palm mutes, breakneck tempos, and snarling lyrics about war, madness, and society. Instead, the band traded those for mid-tempo blues grooves and emotional vulnerability. And it was, of course, a rather well thought through and a calculated decision. The most obvious change of all was, of course, in the guitar work on Load. Instead of the tight, focused distortion from Master of Puppets or Injustice for All, the guitars on Load were warmer, looser, and soaked in tube saturation. For the very first time ever, Metallica tuned their guitars to E-flat on each of the songs on Load, and for the very first time ever, Kirk Hammett, who previously was holding solely the lead guitar duties, did rhythm guitars alongside James Hetfield. And yes, that made a huge difference in the sound for a riff-based band like Metallica was in the early days. And in combination with the overall change in the main influences of James, Lars, and Kirk, who were soaking in the world of blues rock, southern rock, and even country music back at that time, this weird mixture created an absolutely new sound which Metallica propagated throughout the mid to late 90s. And this is exactly the same thing which so many die-hard Metallica fans, including those who followed this band since their early days, simply could not accept. But here I also want to say something which I know many of you might actually hate me for, but at least to me, this wasn't like Metallica was abandoning their heavy sound. Quite the opposite. They were simply redefining what heavy could mean at that time. Just instead of speed, Load explored weight, emotional, lyrical, sonic, and instead of machine-like precision, it was about human texture. As at least to me, in some parts, not on all, but at least in some parts, Load and later on Reload is actually much darker and heavier than pretty much anything Metallica did on their debut record. And that shift wasn't of course only musical, as James Hetfield's lyrics also took a massive turn inward. Instead of the classic thrash metal political themes, hello to everyone who says that metal should stay out of politics, but nevertheless, instead of those and abstract aggression, Hetfield opened up emotionally in ways he hadn't done before, with the songs like Until It Sleeps and The Outlaw Torn being inspired by the heavy events in his family, Bleeding Me capturing his experience in therapy and recovery, and with Mama Said, which, let's be honest here, is practically a country ballad, being James Hetfield confronting his grief basically head on, which at least to me is exactly what makes this song so beautiful. And I truly hope that Mama Said will sound live from the stage once again in a proper manner with the entire band sometime in the future. Let my heart go. But nevertheless, it was on Load when for the very first time ever, James was not really hiding behind any metaphors. And yes, for some fans, it was uncomfortable. And for many others, it is uncomfortable still to see the riff master, Papa Hat, being so raw and vulnerable, which is definitely quite different from the image James Hetfield had before that. And in addition to that, the songwriting process has changed quite a lot because of the influences Kirk Hammett had on it. As by the end of the day, Kirk is actually co-credited on 7 out of the 14 songs featured on Load, which was a huge step forward for him as a composer at Metallica by then, and which was also quite different from the treatment James Newsted's songs have gotten back then. As Jason, still being the new guy after nearly a decade in the band, had tried once again to contribute songs, all of his ideas were pretty much shut down right away, with none of the songs written by James featured on Load, and only one of them later on making on Reload, which James Hetfield was actually quite vocal about later on in his career, and which I believe may be the first reasons for the cracks which later on appeared in the lineup of one of the greatest and the biggest metal bands on the planet. Here guys, real quick, just want to point out that only around 30% of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribed to this channel, so if you're not one of those, and especially if this is not the first video you're watching here, I would really appreciate it if you would consider doing it right now. And also a huge thank you to everyone who helps me keep the heavy metal fire burning here on YouTube by becoming a patron and a channel member and purchasing Metal Pilgrim merch to rock out at the next Metallica concert. Seriously guys, your support means the world to me. So let's continue building this amazing heavy metal community together. If you were a Metallica fan in 1996 and hadn't yet hit a full panic mode because of the sound of Load, its album artwork most likely would do the trick. And especially after you found out what it actually was. Instead of hammers, lightning, or even something remotely metallic, a Load cover was well, strange, unsettling, and definitely not what anyone expected from the band that once called an album Kill 'Em All. But in reality, the image was a photograph titled Semen and Blood III by controversial American artist Andres Serrano. And yes, its name wasn't really metaphorical, as the artwork was literally made by pressing Serrano's own semen and bovine blood between two sheets of plexiglass and photographing the resultant fluid pattern, which was supposed to evoke ideas of beauty through revulsion, life and death, decay and creation. You know, those typical metal things, if you squint hard enough. And unsurprisingly, not everyone was fond of it, including the guys in the band, as James Hetfield famously simply hated the artwork. He called it a disgusting mess and admitted he felt completely disconnected from both concept and the image, as according to him, it simply did not represent Metallica at all. Which is something you can't really say about the way Kirk Hammett viewed that artwork, and still views it today.
Here we go. Metallica Load. Man. Still love that album cover after all these years, I have to say.
In addition to that, Load of course became the first Metallica album on which the band has completely changed their own logo, going from the jagged light and bold M and A that had become synonymous with thrash era Metallica, with a sleeker serif style logo that looked more at home on a fashion label than a patch jacket, which combined with an absolutely new look of all of the Metallica members, who famously cut their hair before Load and started using makeup in the mid-90s, showcased that Load wasn't just another new album by the band. It was an album which has opened an absolutely new era of Metallica, which by itself became a different band from what it was before that. But here's a twist. For all the outrage, eye rolling, and haircut-fueled heartbreak, Load didn't flip. Not even close. When it was released on June 4th, 1996, Metallica's sixth studio album debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, selling over 680,000 copies in its first week. It stayed at the top for 4 weeks straight, eventually going on to sell over 5 million copies in the US alone and over 12 million worldwide. So call it whatever you want, but Load wasn't a misfire. Quite the opposite. It was a huge financial success. And that's exactly why Load quickly became one of the most divisive albums in metal overall. As yes, it is true, for some fans it was a betrayal, and for many it remains such to this very day, as how the flip did Metallica even dare to abandon their thrash metal roots, even in the 1990s. But at the same time, let's not forget that many others, millions of others, simply loved the band's new sound, including me. As yes, the truth is that both Load and Reload hold a very dear place in my heart, and I gladly return to re-listening those in their entirety. And yes, even actually more often so than many of their classic studio records. And the thing is that it was thanks to Load that Metallica was able to stay afloat even in the hardest times for heavy metal. And even more, I'd even dare to say that it was thanks to Load and to what Metallica was doing in the 1990s overall that metal was able to survive the toughest decade in its existence. And of course Metallica wasn't the only one who was contributing to this, but nevertheless they did play an integral part in keeping metal alive through the 1990s.
We're gonna leave now after we smash the hell out of it.
And you know what? Looking back on it in retrospective, I actually have to say that I think that pretty much everyone agrees that many songs from Load and Reload have aged like perfect wine. And the fact that most of them have dozens of millions of streams on streaming platforms today in 2025, I think is actually the best proof for it. Metallica fans are some of the most loyal, passionate, and intense ones on the planet. And that's exactly why an album like Load hit them right in the heart. And I think it was done very much intentionally. To this very day, it is the album that sparks arguments, divides forums, launches memes, and nearly breaks friendships. And yet, today, almost 30 years later, we're still talking about it. And not because it was a failure, like in all honesty, in my opinion, Lulu was, but because it mattered. And that means that it served exactly the purpose Metallica had intended for it. In my opinion, it was an album which has opened the gates to an era of Metallica without which most likely this band would never survive until today. It was the era which helped this band break the routine, push their own boundaries, and yes, invite an absolutely new, sometimes mainstream audience into the Metallica family, making them exactly the band they are today. And I actually believe that the only problem Metallica fans actually have with Load is not the haircuts, the artwork, or the change in the musical direction itself, but rather that it simply didn't tick that nostalgia box. It didn't meet the expectations they set for Metallica, without even asking the band. And the coolest summary, which showcased exactly what I'm trying to say here, and which does that much better than I could ever do, was actually written in the book behind me. As the truth is that in the world of metal, and especially for a band like Metallica, who dared to break all the rules with their Black Album, the idea of selling out simply could not exist after 1991, as the whole idea that there is still a predefined standard for what they should and should not do is absurd by itself, as when Metallica made the Black Album, heavy metal itself had gone mainstream. And that's perhaps the most authentic and the most truly metal thing to do for Metallica in 1996 after the Black Album was to break away from the crowd once again. And that's exactly what they did on Load. But anyways, what do you guys personally think about Load, and should I do a similar video about Reload? Please let us know in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching this video, guys, and we will prevail. Slava Ukraini!